you, Derek, and thank you all for having me here and letting me talk at you for a little bit here this evening. And really want to talk to you about an opportunity that I think that the voters of Oklahoma, the constituents of Oklahoma, and Oklahoma citizens really have to make a difference in the conversations that we're having around Oklahomans experiencing mental illness and addiction, and their families and advocates, and how they can get the kinds of treatment that they need to really succeed in life. And we have an opportunity here through a bill that's going through the Oklahoma legislature in 2020, beginning really next month, fall, or spring rather, so February through May. The legislature will consider a bill that really will address the issue of insurance parity. And this is going to get a little bit wonky, so I apologize if you could just follow through with me here for a second. But really want to stress that this is an issue that you have the opportunity to really move the needle on. We're going to be coming at legislators with a lot of data and sort of cerebral arguments about why this is the right thing to do. What we don't have and what we need help with are individuals who have experienced the issues that we're going to be describing here tonight, and have family who have experienced it and might want to share their story in a really impactful way. So really quickly, I do represent the Healthy Minds Policy Initiative. We're an organization that was funded last year for at least 3 years of work, but likely much more, over the issue of mental health and addiction by the Ann and Henry Zero Foundation. We're a statewide policy organization that will work to provide data-informed arguments to the legislature and other policymakers to really create better efficiencies in our system and allow more Oklahomans to receive treatment. So going into sort of this session, our first real legislative session as an organization, we have a few bills that we're working on, and one probably very impactful bill. And we say it'll be impactful because we've seen in other states just how impactful this is. Now, if you're not familiar with the issue of insurance parity has been a federal law since 2008. The law essentially says that if you are a private insurer and you offer mental health and addiction treatment, you can put no greater restriction on people accessing that treatment than on your other non-behavioral health medical services. So i.e. issues like non-quantitative treatment limitations, a wonky term for things like determinations of medical necessity. So if your provider makes a claim to your insurer, the insurer gets to determine whether that claim is medically necessary. The same thing happens on both the behavioral health side and on the non-behavioral health side. The problem is, for years, there was a tendency for insurers to treat those two buckets differently. So somebody on the behavioral health side might experience more delays to getting that treatment approved, might experience even higher copays, things like that. Additional barriers on the mental health side to verify whether that treatment is necessary on the insurance side versus the non-mental health side. Now, in 2008, when President Bush signed parity into law at the federal level, all of that essentially became illegal. You can't have higher copays for behavioral health addiction coverage than on, say, a knee surgery. Now, that kind of thing is really easy to verify, and insurers have done a really good job of making sure that they comply with parity on that level. What is a little bit more difficult is what I mentioned before, that really wonky term, non-quantitative treatment limitations. Those are anything that's not a dollars and cents reason for why your claim might be denied, or you would need additional approvals to actually get that claim covered. So these are issues that, because of those delays, even if a claim is approved, families are saddled with debt to cover the costs of care that might be life-saving in a lot of ways as the insurer is evaluating a claim, or maybe the claim was denied and it shouldn't have been denied because a comparable service on the other medical kind of side of things would have been approved. Now, we do have some good data. I mentioned before that we're a data organization, and our data in Oklahoma comes from an organization called the Milliman Group. The Milliman Group is a philanthropically funded project that every so often will come out with state level data showing the difference between behavioral health coverage from the private insurance side and the other medical coverage. And a couple of key points I'll throw out to you today. Many of you might be going through this with personal experience, kind of saying, yeah, that data point relates to my situation, or maybe it doesn't. But really in Oklahoma, what we're seeing is that out-of-network utilization is a necessity. So the providers are not in network, so you're experiencing both more difficult providers to reach and more expensive care. So that out-of-network utilization is a key metric of parity, and in particular for inpatient access, in particular for addiction and addiction inpatient access. So in Oklahoma in 2017, Oklahomans were 6.5% more likely to go out of network for inpatient access. That's 25% higher than the national average. For office visit access, just office visit access, you're 4 times more likely to need to go out of network. That does mean higher out-of-pocket costs for you. That does mean higher care overall for the insurers. So then you're talking about more money needed overall from your insurance plan and more expensive costs for you. And then this also plays in the idea of reimbursements for providers, which plays into the idea of whether there's actually a provider in your community at all to provide these services. And we do know that for comparable services, behavioral health providers are paid 27% less than other doctors and other providers who are not behavioral health care. So these are parity violations. They're very systemic. The reasons for them are not because of any one insurer. The federal parity law is very complicated for insurers, but there are very clear ways that we can see that it's being accomplished. So we've got a bill now that is crafted with support from the American Psychiatric Association and really looks at a national best practice model for how you report insurance parity. And it talks all about non-quantitative treatment limitations. It talks all about medical necessity claims and how they're determining what they approve, don't approve, where are the pre-authorizations necessary, all of these things that lead to longer lengths of evaluation of a claim or potential denials. So this plays into the conversation of actual Oklahomans, kind of breaking this down, this sort of wonky policy topic, down to the level of actual Oklahomans. And that's individuals in this group who have experienced what it's like to try to get your claim approved, particularly on the private insurer side. And this is where legislators are really going to understand this issue. I just explained this very wonky thing that probably half of anybody I tried to explain that to went right over their head. It goes over my head half the time, to be completely honest. But what is easy to understand is, let's take a state like Colorado that passed this kind of legislation a couple of years ago. You might have a legislative body reviewing this bill and hearing from an insurance company that parity is the law of the land, which it is on the federal side, but not the nuance that maybe it's not actually being achieved. But in Colorado, they had a really strong network of advocates who actually went to legislators and said, hey, listen, my kid has tried to get treatment. They were denied 3 or 4 times. We actually had a suicide attempt was one story that I heard. Another story was that a family was settled with tens of thousands of dollars worth of debt, trying to get their kid treatment that ultimately saved their life. But these are the kinds of things that legislators are saying, okay, we're breaking down this sort of wonky policy talk and all the data, and we're really understanding now from a face-to-face perspective what this means. This will be one of the more impactful pieces of legislation this year in terms of mental health and addiction in Oklahoma. But it's one that we do need people to kind of step forward and tell their stories. We know that kind of thing passes legislation. And one of the reasons why I asked to come on here and hoping to talk with you all is to sort of break down the barriers. There's a lot of sort of misunderstanding. What does it mean to talk to your legislator? What does it mean to share a really personal story like this where, you know, these things are very personal to us, and I understand that. You know, I talk with a lot of providers and folks who have family experiences in this area, and sometimes this is hard stuff to talk about. But legislators are just your neighbors, and it's important to understand that. We have a citizen legislature. They are often no more knowledgeable on a topic than you are. In fact, as parents who have children who've experienced addiction, you are more knowledgeable, most likely, than your legislator on this topic. And I will tell you very clearly that on 95% of bills that go through the legislature, they actually hear from maybe 0 to 1 constituent on any given bill. And the important thing to remember there is that one constituent contact so often actually informs how they vote on a bill. So they might hear from an advocacy organization like mine on how it's all good and the data show that this is good and we should do it. But where the rubber meets the road is actually talking to people that they represent and they want to. And anybody who comes forward to their legislature, you are actually doing your legislator a favor. I can't tell you how many legislators I've spoken with who say, you know, I really, if I could just hear from my constituents on this issue, if I could just really hear what's happening in my district and the real stories here, I could both have cover to make a vote, I could make an informed vote, I could really feel confident that I'm doing what the people who elected me want me to do. So a couple of tactics there for you right now. First of all, I would love to talk with anybody who has a story of dealing with insurance and particularly around the issue of addiction, particularly private insurance, whether it's a claim denial, whether it was just a long length of wait to get your claim approved, whether it was an issue where an insurer said, we're going to put a length of stay limitation on your treatment, which may be a parity violation. I want to hear those stories. And if you're interested in talking to your legislator, I would love to walk you through what that conversation might look like. But if you don't want that kind of help, go to the Oklahoma legislator website. Google the search phrase Oklahoma legislator lookup, and you will actually just find a web page where you can type your address in and just know who your legislator is. This is not more simple than simply taking out a legislator to coffee and sharing your story, or sending a quick email or a text. Often they'll give you your cell phone, a phone call, and saying, hey, I'm a constituent of yours. Here's my address. Here's my name. I have this experience and I support mental health parity, or I support mental health in the legislature. As simple as that. And that alone often will get a bill passed. So just really quickly too, and then I know we'll have some time to go through questions, and Derek, let me know if anybody's
absolutely
kind of got some questions brewing. But a couple of things to know on parity in particular. We have some confusion around this issue sometimes, and you might hear from your legislator, is this an Obamacare thing? We do often hear that. In fact, actually, no. And I mentioned this law was signed in 2008, and then President Trump, actually, his commission on opioid use recommended parity enforcement as a key measure to curbing the opioid epidemic. So this is a very Republican-driven issue that has Democrat support. So many issues in mental health are like this, right? Where you really do have bipartisan support for an issue. What you don't have as much on the mental health side, particularly in Oklahoma, are individuals who are willing and able to step forward and share their story with those decision makers. So it's harder to say no to a group of teachers who are asking for a teacher pay raise. Thankfully, they got a raise. We were all supportive of that, of course. But it's harder to say no to that than an issue that nobody steps forward on. And like I said, really only one voice is often what it takes. So just be aware that there tends to be some confusion sometimes over the sort of the ideological bent of these issues. This is a very bipartisan issue, and one that is very much able to be swayed by a real face-to-face contact with an individual. This kind of legislation has actually been passed in 7 states in the District of Columbia. I mentioned Colorado was one, and key voices in that conversation were, of course, individuals who actually have direct experience dealing with insurance on mental health issues. Other states included Tennessee, Texas, District of Columbia, Connecticut, I believe, was one of them. So these are states that really aren't all that dissimilar to Oklahoma. These are often red states. These are often states with bipartisan support for the issue, with many instances of individuals who have, well, I will just say, high rates of substance use in their communities. So these are not unfamiliar issues to legislators like those in Oklahoma. We just really need voices. So Derek, that is the end of my presentation.
So I've got a couple of questions. I'll stop writing that one since we're kind of going in. So this is the opportunity. If anybody's got questions for Zack, I mean, this is a huge, broad topic. I'm actually probably going to have a 2-hour conversation with Zack at another time because it interests me and I'm curious. So be sure if you've got questions for Zack, now's the time to kind of be firing those out. So I got a couple of questions that should generate some discussion for Zack. One is, how does somebody know if they're being taken advantage of by their insurance company, and that insurance company might be violating either federal parity laws or state parity laws?
Yeah, it's almost impossible to know. And the reason for it is because parity is a comparative law. So you're comparing one side of one insurance company to another side of one insurance company, and your provider doesn't necessarily know what's happening on the non-behavioral health side. They don't know what kind of pre-authorization is being required. They don't know the length that it's taking to approve a claim, because they're not often dealing with that side of things. So it is very difficult to know. And that's why we need this legislation, quite frankly. This is the kind of best practice reporting structure that will allow organizations like mine and the entire public to look at this data and say, this insurer and this insurer really do need some help making sure that they're complying with parity, because they often don't talk to each other. If you're talking about one specific insurer, they've got a behavioral health wing and they've got medical wing. And often those two sides don't necessarily communicate. So how can you then determine whether you're in compliance with parity?
Isn't it better for the insurance company to not comply with parity? I mean, we kind of have this, at least I do, this kind of preconceived notion that insurance companies are out to cover as little as possible to maximize their profit. So isn't it in their best interest to not follow parity laws?
Well, that would be illegal.
Right.
And certainly insurers like United have been sued over that very issue. There's a lawsuit outside of Illinois right now of a big insurer that's involved in Oklahoma. If you're asking if there's a business reason for not approving claims, of course, but you will never hear an insurer say that. In fact, when we've met with insurers on this issue, they've said that everybody, we comply with parity. No one insurer has ever said we don't comply with parity or we don't make an attempt. The issue, Derek, is that this is a very complicated law. Once you get past are your copays the same? You start getting into these medical necessity conversations. It's very difficult to prove, even internally at an insurer, if you're always kind of in compliance there. This sort of reporting structure is actually helpful. We've heard one major insurer we met with said, this would be helpful for us, just making sure that we're in compliance because we don't want to be sued.
Right.
And that sort of thing.
What should somebody do if they feel like they're being treated unfairly in relation to parity law? What's the best course of action for somebody like me who doesn't know about insurance? I mean, could we contact you guys as an organization, or are there other organizations that can help me find out if I'm being taken advantage of?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. And really, if you do suspect a parity violation, you can contact the Oklahoma Insurance Department. If it's a employer-sponsored plan, they have regulatory authority over that. That would be the way to go. Okay. I will say, unfortunately, in Oklahoma, our insurance department probably isn't staffed and resourced enough to really do this, and so that would be phase 2 in our efforts, is to make sure that those resources are there to enforce compliance.
So this is a complicated question that came in from the Zoom chat. So I'll read it and then we'll kind of break down because I think there are parts of this question that we can probably answer today, and parts of this question that probably neither of us are qualified. But let's dig into it. Mm-hmm. So the question is: many insurance decisions are based on medical necessity, which we've talked about a little bit. Can you address whether and how those decisions based on medical necessity can be a violation of parity law?
So the violation of parity law, and this is a little bit nuanced with the law. There's no North Star necessarily in saying every insurer has to treat this medical necessity the same across the board. Really, it's a comparison law. So I mentioned what matters is how that insurer is also treating the non-behavioral health side of things. So if they're doing something for somebody who's in addiction treatment that they're not doing for knee surgery, for example, saying, I know your provider needs you to stay here for a week. We're going to say 2 days max. Would they be doing that on knee surgery? That's what we're looking at, is that sort of thing.
I feel like that happens all the time.
All the time, especially in addiction.
Especially in addiction and behavioral health, because I know that I've had personal phone calls during, and it's been so long since I've had them now, I'm trying to think of what the term is, where I've been talking to an insurance provider about why we need to keep this 17-year-old in treatment. Mm-hmm. But because that 17-year-old has gotten a little bit better, they're telling me it's no longer medically necessary.
Right.
Is anything in the new legislation going to help address some of those?
Well, it's going to give us information on when that's actually happening. So if there are any trends on any given insurance company, we'll be able to see that. But you're absolutely right. This is something where you'll often hear this. This is a story I hear all the time from providers is, well, we're trying to get this person treated and we know they need to stay, best practices, they need to stay in 10 days, 14 days, whatever it is. But they don't have a gun and they're not threatening to shoot themselves. Yeah. So the insurer is saying it's not medically necessary. Well, that's as much often depression is as much of a life-threatening condition often as anything on the non-behavioral health side might be. You were in a car accident, you need a blood transfusion. Your risk of dying might actually be relatively similar on either side of that equation, but the insurer might be treating depression differently than the car accident and saying that we're going to cut you off at 3 days. Yeah. And that's where we feel like maybe there's a parity violation there we need to look at.
Yeah. So I think we've got one more coming in. I'm going to read it first. It's a long one, so I like to read it first.
Sure.
To make sure I say it right. Okay, so this is fairly straightforward. In getting feedback on why people don't file parity complaints, what are some of the top reasons? She notes that lack of knowledge on how to file a complaint, is you kind of mentioned. She also imagines not wanting to go through the hassle, or maybe people potentially fearing retaliation from insurance companies if they do file a complaint. And are there any safeguards against retaliation from an insurance complaint?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I can fully address that. What I can address is, yes, you can file a complaint with the state insurance department. There are national resources out there, depending on how your insurer is regulated. But really, I do hear this comment from providers. And I talked with an individual at Parkside who handles private insurance claims, Parkside over in Tulsa, Psychiatric Institute. And he says, often what does clear this up is frankly just a phone call to the insurer from the family. More often than not, actually will get rid of the issue that they're facing. The provider might try to file a claim and say, it's been denied, but when the family reaches out, it actually is it isn't as much of an issue. And it really plays into this conversation of maybe some people think the insurance is a big bad guy in the room. Every insurer is different. Certainly every insurer is different. The data that we've seen in other states show that there's a big difference often. But really they're often trying to do the right thing. On the individual level, they're not looking to deny you specifically because there's a certain amount of market edge there that's needed. If you reach out to them, it makes a big difference. At least so I've been told.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Are there any other top reasons why people wouldn't file a claim that you guys maybe have seen any research tracking that you've done?
Why they wouldn't file a complaint about a parity violation? Well, I think it's this issue is so wonky that I don't think I don't think people realize that parity is the law of the land and what it means. It's hard, even like I mentioned, it's hard for insurers to know when there's a violation alone, and their best lawyers are on the case. It's hard for them to figure that out sometimes. It's hard for insurance regulators to figure this out, which is why we're doing this kind of analysis via this legislation. So from the average individual, it's just one of those issues. It's tough. It's tough. Yeah. Other states who've gone a little bit further, our first attempt at this legislation, Derek, is very modest. We're looking at reporting and working with insurers on what those reports say and how can we address any violations that come up, and working in good faith with insurers to do that. Other states have gone a little bit further and said, we're going to have some strict enforcement requirements around this. They've said, we're going to actually deny any requests for increasing costs or increasing rates if you don't comply with parity. Those are some kind of more radical measures that have been taken in other states. And they've put more resources toward their insurance departments to regulate. Those are all things that may or may not be right for Oklahoma. But we're going to start with this. We're going to get the data. We're going to see what's happening, and we're going to rely on stories and figure that out.
Yeah. A part of this is me talking in a little bit of ignorance, but hopefully I'm not the only one that doesn't understand politics. I know there are times that legislation doesn't pass because there's an attempt to tackle on lots of other things that aren't related to the main thing onto bills. Is there a possibility that happens with this particular piece of legislation, or is this entirely about insurance parity?
Well, there are more than 2,000 bills that have been filed this session. It'll be a lot of issues floating out there. We think this will be one of the least controversial ones because it's not a new mandate. It's something insurers are already required to do. We're just wanting some more transparency, and we're wanting to work with them to make sure that Oklahoma's are getting treated, because we've got the data that show parity isn't actually really happening in Oklahoma. So something is behind that. So work with us, insurers. Let's find the data. Let's figure out the right reporting structure, and let's get to the bottom of that. So hopefully, if I'm answering your question right, I should probably also address the issue of bipartisanism. Whether this could get caught up in some sort of partisan bickering debate over what's left or what's right, and really this issue, like I said before, in every state this has gone through, has been wholly bipartisan. No side of the political spectrum agrees or disagrees that their constituents should have access to the mental health care that they are legally obligated to have access to under current law. That is a very non-controversial statement, and that's where we are.
Okay, excellent. Kind of a final roll call on anybody that might be watching on Facebook or might be watching in the Zoom room. Other questions for Zack related to insurance parity or any of the things that we've talked about today?
And Derek, as you're waiting for that, I'll just say one more quick thing, and it's a reiteration of what I said before. I think you're going to put my email address in the stream online. Please reach out to me. if you feel like you need some, talking, would a legislator want to hear this? Is this a parity violation? Should I talk to somebody? Let me know. I'm happy to walk you through that. Otherwise, as I said, the Oklahoma legislature website, find out who your House representative is, find out who your state senator is. It'll be listed right there. Shoot them an email, say, hey, parity is a bill that's coming across your desk. I care about it. I have a personal experience. Give me a call if you want to talk about it. That's really what we need.
Does the parity issue also apply to prescription drug costs?
It can. There's so many different kind of wings to this. That's not really addressed by our bill right here. Parity is you start getting into provider parity. Are providers existing? Is your network adequacy? Is your network adequacy there? Is the term that we use. Those are all kind of next steps that we're looking at after this passes. Yeah.
Great. One final roll call for anybody that might have any additional questions for Zack. Just to reiterate what he said, if you do want to reach out and contact Zack, if you've got further questions for him, or if their organization might be able to help you, his email address is in the public thread of this video on Facebook. You can go there and get that. Doesn't look like we've got any final questions. Zack, thank you so much for your time, man.
Yep.
Really great stuff. Oh, there is one more.
Okay.
Oh, just great info. It was just a compliment. Just great info.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for being here. Yeah. So let me take this video back over here. Again, thanks you, Zack, for being here, man. If anybody's got questions, please reach out. Here's my big takeaway. I always like to have kind of one thing that I think about. And this is something that Zack and I were talking about even before we started, is that it actually matters. It matters that you reach out to your legislators and talk to them. I had no idea that there were a big portion of legislators that are making policy decisions based on one or two interactions with constituents, and that oftentimes they don't hear from anybody about particular bills. So I think the main thing for me is we're in charge of bettering our community, which means that we have to be responsible for reaching out and for stepping up to the plate and saying, hey, this is an issue we care about. This is what we want to happen in our state. And if we're not doing those things, we're going to have to sleep in the bed that we made, right? So it matters. Reach out to your legislator. Thank you guys for joining us here for Parents Helping Parents. Be back for our next one, which is going to be on February the 3rd. Right here, 7 o'clock. Scott Brewer, a licensed marriage and family therapist from OK Family Therapy, will be here talking about the role of family in addiction treatment. You're not going to want to miss that. I have not met Scott yet, but he comes highly recommended by one of our other guests. So thank you, everybody, for being here, and we will catch you next time. I don't know how to make this go away. There it goes.